も勝つ。何としてでも生きる。
Yo, what's going on, Tiny Planet? It is your alpha male Chad boy King Tiny X here, back with another video, and you guys already know the deal. This is going to be what if Issei had the system, and for this, like while basically trying to make my script for it, I was thinking, hey, should I really be including like all of the events solo leveling in there, or should I just kind of gloss over them, like just make quick summaries of them? Let me know what you guys want in the comments below, and we'll just judge off of this part alone. Now here's how things are going to work. Strange portals would have actually begun to appear all around the world one day. With these portals came strange creatures though. Over the years, people would actually find themselves capable of wielding magic, or presumably magic. They weren't quite sure at the time. It was just the easiest thing they could call it. The level of magic would vary from person to person. Some would actually be incredibly strong, while others, they were just above the average man in terms of capabilities. A new occupation would actually be opened up from this new event, with all of these people being capable of wielding magic. This new occupation would have been called hunters. Hunters were basically meant to go into the portals and fight off the monsters that were in there before they could leak into their own human realm. It had happened on a couple of occasions, and well, the results weren't all that pretty. Issei would have actually been one of the people born with magic. He wanted to be a hunter for the money and the girls. A pretty shallow reason, but he had a reason nonetheless. His parents wouldn't have been blessed with magic though. Even though Issei had magic, he wasn't all that impressive. He was just above the average man in physical capabilities, according to the rankings for the hunter system. He would have been classified as an E rank hunter for the most part. Issei's parents, they would eventually be forced to move due to frequent portals in their area that they lived at in the time. Or well, they lived in at the time. Basically, the area was just ransacked with a bunch of portals, and they just couldn't afford to live there anymore. They would be forced to move into one of the worse areas that didn't necessarily have as many portals appearing over there. They weren't able to afford the nice areas that had several high-class hunters living there as well, so their protection was also limited. Issei would have been forced to take on the role of a hunter in order to help his parents financially. Portals, otherwise known as dungeons in this world, they were often occurrences that would end up being costly in the end. Just buying a decent home nowadays would actually cost a pretty penny due to the insurance needed as well. And of course, insurance would have rocketed through the roof at this point in time. Issei, while being a hunter, he would just barely be able to make ends meet. He was the lowest of the ranks after all, so fighting off monsters would be rather difficult for Issei. He was trying to balance school as well, and at times he really did seem to just go into like a mental breakdown at times because of the amount of stress that it would build up for him. Him being a pervert did not make life any easier either. Girls would usually find him repulsive, and the fact he wasn't a strong hunter didn't give him any cool factors either. One day, while fighting to survive against some monsters though, Issei and this group, they would actually discover a strange door. Opening it up, they'd find something extremely odd. This oddity being several statues in what looked like a rather polished room. It was very unusual. It did not fit the theme of the rest of the dungeon at all. Some of the hunters would actually walk up to one of the statues. This statue would be holding up a book with some strange writing on it. Most of the words were unreadable though, but a couple could be made out. A couple of words were capable of being read, of being readable, I mean to say. These words being to worship, praise, and to prove your faith. They would be confused at first until the statues, they actually began to move. The doors were beginning to close too. Some would begin to try and run to the exit, but either get shot down by the statue sitting on the throne or get pierced through by the statues guarding the door. Issei would have been panicking as well until he tripped over himself. The throne statue was approaching Issei. He would be completely ignored though. Issei was in a bowing position. He would remember the words that were said before, with the first being to worship. He assumed that bowing was a form of worshipping, and to this giant statue. Issei would yell at the others to follow his lead after discovering this. Some would, but others, they would attempt to fight out the statue still. Well, a couple of others would try and follow up with a worship thing, but they would end up worshipping the wrong god. Essentially, they would try and they would basically try and praise Buddha or something. Issei would unfortunately have to witness the death of those people. They would have failed. They would have all failed in the end. Those who tried to fight out the statues and those who just trying to keep praising them. Keep praising their own religion as well, their own religious god. It would end up being futile in the end. Of course, when it came on to those who would try and fight off the statues, they would have ended up realizing that the statues were incredibly durable. It would have been a losing fight. These statues were too durable for them to even make a dent in. They would have been unfortunately killed off. The other hunters that bowed down, they were the ones that were spared. The ones that actually listened to Issei would live, but bowing basically wouldn't last for too long afterwards. After that part of the rituals was done with, the royal statue would begin to approach the remaining hunters now. They would actually begin to attack them as well now. Issei, he would be forced to get up as quick as possible. He noticed that the statues along the wall, they weren't moving, so he would try to run over to one of them as a form of protection. This one wielded a shield. All of a sudden, they began to move though, about to attack Issei. Issei would notice this and he would quickly run away from their reach. One of Issei's crewmates, they would request for everyone to find a statue with a musical instrument though. They were under one that wielded a harp. Rather than attacking them, they were actually playing music. Issei, he would look around frantically until he managed to find one with a flute. Once he was able to hide behind that, he would end up hearing the music and he would calm down a bit. A large altar would eventually arise though from the floor once they had passed that trial. Once they saw this, Issei would actually remember the last part of this apparent ritual, this being to prove their faith. The only conclusion Issei could come to was a sacrifice. It seemed that a couple of others came to the same conclusion, judging by their reactions. The issue now would be to figure out who was going to be the brave soul to sacrifice themselves. The team leader would be the first one to actually go, seeing as how he was the one to have gotten them into this mess in the first place. He was concerned with the money they'd get from this mission dwindling if they didn't defeat the boss. He regretted those words, especially with all of the casualties they faced. So this was basically his way of repenting for his selfishness at the time. The altar needed more sacrifices though. Issei would be hesitant alongside the others, but he would eventually step forward as well. He knew everyone here had families after all. In the grand scheme of things, Issei was simply a lowly E-ranker, barely capable of anything, while everyone else was at least somewhat capable. They had families to go back to. Some of them were breadwinners after all, and some of these were like D and C rankers, so that meant that they would prove to have more worth to society than Issei would. He would hop onto the altar, and it seemed that this amount was enough. The doors would open up and everyone would quickly make their way out. The guards were starting to move again though. This time all of the statues were moving, getting closer to the altar. Issei's heart, it would begin to race here. He was the second to last person that needed to escape now, or else it would be certain death. The team leader would have ran out, being faster than Issei. Issei would attempt to run too, but the doors would have closed shut after his party captain just barely slipped past the doors. Issei would have been trapped here. The soldiers would begin to walk toward Issei. He would try to run, but he would get caught up in their line of action. Issei would get stabbed through the stomach, but at that moment, time seemingly froze for him. Some weird message would pop up in his line of vision. It would request for him to make a decision on whether he would become a player or not. If he chose no, then he would die in 0.1 seconds. Issei didn't really have much choice in the matter, so he would choose yes. Everything would go black for Issei though afterward. When he woke up, he'd find himself in a hospital, and to his surprise, there wasn't a giant gaping hole in his stomach. He would be confused as to what was going on though. His parents would arrive in the room and be overjoyed to see their son seemingly unharmed. Issei, he would be confused though, wondering what happened. They would explain how he was found unconscious in the dungeon and that he was brought to the hospital in order to get checked out. They were worried about him. Issei, he would remember how he was trapped back in that dungeon, and wonder how he was still alive, especially with how the last time he remembered, he literally got stabbed through the stomach. A message would appear once again in Issei's line of eyesight though, or like line of vision, however you guys want to say it. This time around, Issei would see it telling him to do some form of exercising, revolving around him doing a bunch of push-ups, like 100 of them. The same amount for sit-ups and like a 10-kilometer run. And there was probably one other exercise, maybe like some pull-ups or something. Not exactly sure, or maybe it was squats. But overall, Issei, he found everything that the system was telling him to do would be completely ridiculous. After all, he literally just woke up in a hospital bed. He was just going to relax for the next couple of days, if anything. He would actually finally get a break from his stressful life. I mentioned that there would be consequences in case he failed to go a day without going through the training though. Issei, he didn't know what sort of punishment to expect though, and he wasn't planning on doing that exercise either, so he would end up just waiting the whole day out. The system would alert him of the fact that he had failed to complete his task. and therefore he would get his punishment. He would get teleported to a sandy wasteland, and the quest given to him now was to survive. Issei would be confused. He would raise an eyebrow, wondering what it meant by survive, until he saw what looked like a giant scorpion running his way. He would run for as long as possible, even when his legs felt like giving out on him at any moment. He would have passed, sure, but he would have also been traumatized. He didn't want to go back to that area. He would do his best to accomplish his daily quests and begin to even see improvements with his body over time as well. He was getting stronger and faster. He was even building up some muscle. One day he would be given a key by the system. The system would give him instructions on where he was to go in order to use the key. He would end up finding himself by the subway, and when stretching out the hand with the key, Issei would seemingly create his own gate. When entering said gate, Issei would find there was some dog creature waiting for him. He was forced to fight it. The system explained what their species was as well. They weren't anything special in terms of monsters. Issei would actually manage to take the monster down with a little difficulty, but he would find that wasn't the only one. More would begin to show up, and Issei would have to fend off against each and every last one of them. Their numbers were what was really troubling for Issei. They were relatively weak physically, but in packs, that was another story. Issei would find that he actually had some form of storage after defeating each and every last one of these wolves. Considering that they ended up leaving droppings, Issei had no problem taking them. That's when he would have ended up finding out about the storage part of the system that was apparently built into it. He would have actually found this to be quite convenient in holding all of the droppings he was getting from the creatures. He was still nerve-wracked over the fact that he was going through a dungeon by himself. More often than not, going through a dungeon, it would actually require a team after all. There usually needed to be a healer on every single team, but Issei, he was taking down monsters on his own left and right. Issei would have had some scratches on him, sure, and he was also bleeding a little, but he would push forward until he found the boss. He had already managed to take down all of the wolves at this point. When it came onto the boss, they weren't so easy to take down. Like the name suggested, they were of course the boss, the strongest of all of the enemies here. Issei would find it to be his most difficult fight yet, but he could tell it would be worth his while if he defeated this gatekeeper. Issei could tell he was going to get stronger from this system, and that once he defeated this boss, exponentially stronger actually, he could tell from beforehand that he was getting stronger. He was wondering just how much stronger he would get now. He remembered how weak he used to be in comparison to now. He never wanted to go back there. His former self was barely able to handle some of the weaker monsters, such as goblins, but now he managed to take down several wolf creatures, and he wasn't already dead while fighting the boss. That already showed signs of major improvement. Issei felt that he could get even stronger from here though. He would push forward, and he would try to stab the monster with teeth from the deceased wolves. It wouldn't take down the boss right away, but it was slowly beginning to dwindle their health. Issei, he would manage to climb up to the monster's head, and with a sudden boost of strength, he would be capable of crushing their skull after using a rusty blade he found while fighting the wolves. Issei would be exhausted, but he would cheer over the fact that he was capable of actually killing a boss, especially on his own, not even any sort of group effort. He managed to kill some sort of boss on his own. That was quite an achievement in Issei's book, and the system would even award him quite heavily in all honesty. Well, from Issei's perspective, that was. The system would award him with some items such as a blade with a poisonous effect made from the boss he had just fought, and the bag would seem to be a double-edged blade. The substance within it could make his skin stronger, but due to the poisonous nature of it as well, his muscles would be permanently weakened. Issei would take the blade, but he would leave the bag in the storage for a later date. Issei would leave and continue training with the system, eventually growing to the strength of a B-rank hunter. It would have been just in time for the next school year too. Issei, he wouldn't have realized it at the time, but he had grown taller and actually gotten more muscle onto his frame as well. Beforehand, he was quite scrawny and short as well. Now, he was barely recognizable with his sharper features. Matsuda and Motohama, they would actually be sure to point it out when Issei greeted them. They were barely able to recognize him at first either. They were barely able to recognize Issei until he greeted them and they heard his voice. They were like, there is no way that you could have gotten such a major growth spurt in just one summer. Girls would have been surprised to find that it was Issei Hyodo, one of the biggest perverts at their school. He was more appealing in their eyes now, but his perverted ways, it would still push them away. Issei, he would begin to show a different side to himself throughout the school year. It seemed like his appearance wasn't the only thing that changed. While he was a pervert still, he was far more seclusive with it. He'd settle for just simply buying magazines for the most part, and this new aura that he had, it would actually even affect his friends as well. Issei would be seen going on more dates throughout the school year, making the other boys envious of Issei. The girls had become more comfortable around Issei after he had stopped being such a major pervert. It really did seem that he had gone through some growth and development, not even just physically but mentally as well. During this summer, they wondered what could have gotten into Issei, but they weren't really complaining. Issei was much more desirable in their eyes, and the boys, they would try and catch up with Issei. With Issei, they would simply try and better themselves in order to compete with Issei Hyodo, who was basically quickly becoming the new prince of Kuo Academy. Issei, he would go through more dungeons and he would begin to actually collect a good sum of money for once in his life with how much more capable he had become in combat. Matsuda and Motohama, though not blessed with magical enhancements, they would try to keep up with Issei by joining some sports and clubs as well. They were still perverts, sure, but they didn't have as much time to peek at the girls' locker room. They felt like they had way more purpose right now. One day, Issei, he would actually get approached by a girl with black hair. She would end up introducing herself as Yuma, and that she was apparently new to the school. She was wondering if Issei could help her find her classes. Issei would oblige, and by the end, she would ask to go on a date with him. Issei, he wouldn't have realized what she had in store for him though. Ria's Creamery, one of the most attractive girls within Issei's school, would have actually noticed something off about Yuma. She would try and keep close watch of the two. Issei was none the wiser though. As far as he was concerned, while he was on his date with Yuma, it seemed to be completely normal. It was quite enjoyable actually. It was only when they were walking through the park at night did their atmosphere begin to shift. She would ask Issei a question, that being, well, would you die for me? Issei, he would immediately say no though. Before he could elaborate, he would dodge an attack from the girl. She was now dressed in leather, and for some reason, she had black feathered wings as well. He was confused. Was she a monster, or was this just her magic? But even then, what sort of magic would allow her to grow wings though? He was heavily confused, but Yuma would end up revealing her real name to be Rainier, and that she found Issei to actually be quite pathetic. She would mention how he had some good reflexes, sure, but it meant nothing in the end. Even if she genuinely wanted to date him, during the date she found him to be too soft. She liked men that would usually take charge after all. Dominant men, you could say. Issei was far too submissive in her opinion. Issei would dodge more light spears from the girl before he found an opening. He would rush in faster than she could see, and he would slice her with his dagger. It would have been shallow, but the poison's effect would actually begin to take place instantly. Her veins would begin to bulge as she screamed bloody murder. Once Rainier died, Issei, he would find that he had leveled up according to the system. Issei would sigh and leave the corpse to the girl. Rias would have teleported over to the park not too long after Issei left, expecting to see him bleeding out. Instead, she would see Rainier's corpse with her veins still bulged out. Rias would question who was capable of doing this. She would begin to think back to Issei and admit that he did emit a stronger presence than most of the kids within their school, but she never expected for him to actually be strong enough to take on a fallen angel. She supposed those hunters had really begun to step up their game within recent years. Rias wanted him to be part of her peerage as soon as possible now. She was curious as to what Issei really was. His aura, now that she was really thinking about it, did not match up with the rest of the hunters. It seemed more mysterious in a way, almost unbefitting of a human. It seemed to be beyond that, and she wanted to know more. She wanted to get that sort of being onto her peerage. That way, she would become an even more powerful king, have an even more powerful peerage, and be able to take down that not even rotten, but just that annoying dude by the name of Riser. She was not interested in getting married to this guy at all, after all. Issei honestly wouldn't have focused too much on the incident that night. Instead, he would be more focused on putting his efforts toward staying away from, receiving any penalties from the system. Most of the time, Issei would have been investing in going through dungeons that the system seemingly created for him and defeating the monsters that were contained within said dungeons. Issei would rapidly level up because of this, and he would even gain new skills along the way. In one of his most recent dungeons as well, he ended up having to fight several knights. It was a rather hard fought battle considering the swarm of knights that just did not appear to slow down whatsoever. They honestly appeared out of nowhere, and it was a struggle for him to even keep up at times. But Issei's relief would have actually came in the form of the penalty zone, interestingly enough. He had begun to do his daily quest that day, since he expected that this dungeon wouldn't have taken him too long to get through, but he was apparently wrong, and he was actually really glad to be wrong this time around. Even when he was sent to the penalty zone, Issei, he didn't run away in fear this time around. No, instead he was actually more confident in himself this time around, in his own abilities. Even with the monsters that came at him, Issei would use his built-up combat skills that he developed over time to actually fight back against these creatures, and he would actually kill several of them. He wasn't sure at first if he would actually gain any points from fighting the monsters in the penalty zone, but to his pleasant surprise, he did. Issei would smirk finding this out. This was going to be fun. He was going to enjoy this quite a bit. It was honestly pretty much just a slaughter for Issei. After his time was up in the penalty zone, Issei had actually gone up a couple of levels, but even then he felt as if he wasn't really ready yet for the Knights. The system would actually alert him of a couple of things as a response, the first being, of course, some sort of runestone he seemingly picked up earlier on in the dungeon. It was in his inventory up until now, and he would crush it in his hands with hopes of unlocking a useful skill. This skill would actually be called Dominator's Touch, which in simple terms would be comparable to telekinesis for Issei. Issei would also, buy a dagger from the system store, which was meant to be used against knights specifically. It was oddly convenient, but Issei wasn't really going to question it. It was kind of funny how the thing was literally called Night Killer as well. That was just some serious luck on Issei's part, but he wasn't complaining. There was one more thing though, and suddenly the system screen began to morph as if someone was sort of overriding it somehow. In the system's place was a red screen with green text that mentioned something about awakening the boosted gear, and on Issei's right arm would appear a red gauntlet with a green gem in the middle. Issei didn't really understand it at first, but so long as it didn't get in his way, he wouldn't focus on it too much. The screen would switch back to normal and Issei would be teleported back to the dungeon, where he would use Dominator's Touch on his new dagger, Night Killer, to, kill several knights. It would be a lot faster now, and he would have been more swift in his movements this time around as well. It was as if two people were fighting off the knights instead of just Issei alone. The red gauntlet's gem would glow at times as well, with the voice of someone yelling "Boost!" emitting from it. Issei didn't really know what was up with that, but he felt stronger the more it yelled "Boost." His movements and control over Dominator's Touch increased as well during this time. Issei would have cut down on the army of knights with ease thanks to the boosted gear, boosting his stance, and he would eventually find the magicians who were controlling the summoning of the knights. He would swiftly kill every last one of them, and he actually did remember how he had to, deal with a rather tall knight clad in red, but even they fell to the might of Issei in the end as well. This knight, of course, being somebody that he had to deal with as a seemingly boss for these knights. That one was just on a completely different level from the rest of the knights, but of course, not enough to put Issei down. When he was done fighting though, boosted gear would actually disappear, and so would his stat boosts. Issei would actually collapse to one knee, and he would find that he was exhausted. It actually seemed like boosted gear did take some sort of toll on him. It would be worth it though, considering how he would be offered a job by the system. Though he needed to also figure out when to use boosted gear, especially when combined with whatever job he was going to get. He figured that he was probably going to get like an assassin or fighter type and job, considering his skills, the way he fought and everything, but that was just going off of assumptions. Maybe for all he knew, he could get like an archer or a tank, for crying out loud. With Issei's skill set, he would imagine he would be more suited towards the assassin class, but none of these would actually be on the list. Oh no. Turns out it would be none of them, but something far more sinister in nature, you could say. The necromancer class. Issei's heart would just drop reading this. At first he wanted to reject it, but the system mentioned that this was some sort of hidden class. This actually intrigued Issei now that he thought about it. Maybe there was a benefit to joining this class after all. He had heard stories about people displaying abilities that seemed to fit into more than just one class after all. Although these seemed to either be like the reawakened or, well, S-rank fighters. Issei would end up deciding to take on the necromancer class after all, but it ended up evolving in a way. It mentioned something about Issei exceeding a certain amount of points, which this class was class to be upgraded. His class was now called Monarch of the Shadows. The system would have explained that he had gained a couple of new skills that were job specific, and the main one that he found to be the most enticing was shadow extraction. He could apparently extract the shadows from the dead and make them part of his undead army. The system required for him to create a command for whenever he wished to summon the undead. This command he would end up choosing would of course be Arise. The only issue now was that he had a limited amount of shadows that he could summon, and an even lesser amount to preserve for future usage. He managed to summon, say, like around 30 soldiers, but out of those 30, only 20 could be permanently added to his army and, well, be used for later usage as well. Issei looked around and admired this new army of his, but he began pondering what would happen if we added a monster of, say, an A rank status or higher. That was probably a better investment in the long run. He would send a good portion of his soldiers to the realm of nothingness while he headed over to one specific knight clad in red, sort of similar to that weird gauntlet that was, well, formed on his arm earlier, which helped him in his fight. This was a knight he recognized to be rather strong and on a whole other level compared to the rest of the soldiers that he had to fight. Even in his empowered state, Issei recognized that this one was just tougher to take down than the others. Issei had a couple of chances to extract the shadow of the one known as Egress, but the first two tries were fails. Issei would become frustrated and he would try to speak some sense into this knight. He would state that their king was dead. Whoever they were protecting at the time, they were dead. There was nothing to protect anymore. It would be better to join Issei's army and become stronger underneath him, rather than just waste his time here. It would be like a second chance at life in a way. He wasn't even really sure if they could hear him or not, but it was practically Issei just venting out his frustrations with the commander. He didn't want to waste such an opportunity, after all. Issei would try one more time with the knight, and this time around he would seemingly get through to Egress. He would have successfully extracted the shadow and have the knight join his army. Issei's army consisted of mainly knights of standard class. A high-ranked commander, of course, being Egress, and 3 mages. Issei would rename the Red Knight as simply Egress, and he would be pleased with his rewards from this dungeon. Being a necromancer, it didn't seem as bad as he thought. Now that he was really experiencing it for himself, he could get used to this actually. A new aura seemed to surround Issei when he arrived out to the dungeon, something that many were able to detect the next day at school. This wasn't the same Issei that they had once known. This was a completely different character. Even Rias recognized this and wanted to find out the cause for this. Issei seemed to just walk around with a wave of authority. She wanted to recruit him more than ever now. During class, Issei would be approached by the Prince of Cool Academy, Kiba. Many of the girls would immediately begin to gossip, questioning why Kiba was even speaking to someone like Issei. Some would comment on the fact that Issei seemed to have had a growth spurt recently. Maybe Kiba felt threatened somehow. They've talked about his appearance changing over time, but now that they're really looking at it, shoot, Issei seemed to rival Kiba in terms of appearance. So maybe Kiba was here to address it. Or maybe Kiba was going to welcome him into the Brotherhood or something. They even recognized how Issei had changed his ways over time as well. So they were questioning what was the whole reason why Kiba was here. But Kiba would mention something along the lines of Ria's Grimoire wanting to meet with Issei for some sort of offer, which would cause for Issei to raise an eyebrow hearing this. Just what kind of offer were they talking about? This really piqued his curiosity, so he would follow Kiba to meet with Rias in the Occult Research Club's room. There, Issei would find out some information from the girl. This information, of course, being regarding the offer Kiba mentioned earlier, and apparently Rias was interested in having Issei join her peerage. And Issei would be confused until Rias explained that humans had a pretty similar system in which they formed guilds, but when it came on to Rias, you see, she was a devil, and with devils, they worked with slightly different rules. By joining her peerage, Issei would become a devil himself, and his potential would grow as well. There were some perks to being part of her peerage, but none that Issei would really consider useful for him. Issei would just reject the offer, mentioning how he had already had his own peerage technically. This confused Rias until he summoned his army. All of the peerage members would immediately be on guard, but Issei would calm them down by explaining that he had no intention of actually harming them. This was just meant to be his own display of power, and nothing more. That, and from the looks of them, he realized that the group was fairly weak, so they would probably end up holding him back if he were to actually join the peerage. This would actually offend Rias quite a bit, hearing this, and she would try to intimidate Issei by powering up herself, and Issei would still have a rather blank look on his face. He wasn't impressed whatsoever. But suddenly, a magical circle would appear with two individuals arriving out of it. The individuals Rias would recognize were Grafia Lucifer and, Riser Phoenix, otherwise known as her sister-in-law and, Rias' fiancé. Issei would be confused as to who these people were though. Grafia would question if she was interrupting something, considering how she saw an unfamiliar face in the form of Issei. She wasn't informed of Rias gaining a new peerage member either, unless she was in the middle of recruiting the boy. Issei would just be speechless though. He would be enamored by Grafia's beauty. Riser wouldn't even acknowledge the boy's presence though. His concern was more so with his wife-to-be, Rias. Riser would approach her and he would try to touch her chin, but she would swat away his hand, repulsed at the fact that he would even try to touch her. Issei would be confused as to the whole situation. Rias would notice the confused look on Issei's face and she would immediately explain the situation to Issei, and one of the main reasons that she wanted him to join her peerage. She had been forced into a marriage with this narcissistic burnt turkey from the Phoenix clan, and for the longest she had been trying to get out of her marriage with this guy. She was hoping to get some sympathy points from Issei, and that would probably convince him to join her peerage, even if it was temporary. But Riser would just laugh at how Rias described him, calling the girl stubborn, but she would learn in due time how to submit to him. Issei, unfortunately didn't particularly like this guy's attitude, but also didn't care to join Rios' peerage either. He didn't really want to get involved in these sort of affairs, so he would try to take his leave. But Greyfear would clutch his shoulder though, explaining that as a mere human, he wouldn't actually be allowed to leave here knowing about the existence of devils, and that she would have to wipe his memory clean of these events. Issei had no intention of allowing that to happen though. Via the use of, Dominator's touch, he was able to remove her grip on his shoulder, which would surprise Greyfear. Issei would flare his aura, and he would explain that Greyfear would do no such thing to him. Greyfear's eyes would widen, recognizing this sort of aura. It was belonging to that of him. Rios' generation knew nothing about this guy, but Greyfear had known all too well just how powerful the Shadow Monarch was. Issei's potential was immense, just going based off of the fact that he shared the power of the Shadow Monarch. She never expected for them to have found a vessel with how powerful a person had to be to become one. Greyfear wouldn't do anything to Issei after that. Seeing Greyfear in a stupefied state would actually surprise Rios. She had never seen her sister-in-law act like this before. She always seemed so calm and reserved, but now she was acting like she had just seen a ghost. Issei would go on to do his, daily quest and continue to take on more dungeons as well. Rios' Peerage, they would have ended up attempting to fight Riser's own in a rating game to free Rios from her marriage with Riser, but unfortunately, it would all fall through in the very end. Rios would actually be forced to marry Riser, considering the fact that she couldn't bypass his regenerative properties. It would be a rather unhappy marriage for Rios, although when it came on to Riser, he felt like the luckiest man in the world. But that was none of Issei's concern though. Sona would attempt to actually get Issei to join her peerage next, but once again he would reject the offer, which would surprise Sona. He would mention that he was fine doing the solo act. He'd done it for a while now, and he was getting pretty good results from it. He had yet to plateau as well, so why fix something that wasn't broken? Plus, Rios Grimoire had offered him a chance to join her peerage at one point as well, and he rejected their offer. So why would he accept Sona's over Rios' own? There was really nothing that either one of them offered that would actually benefit Issei in the long run. Nothing that was really all that interesting to Issei. Issei would go back to his regular duties, or regular activities of leveling up, and while Issei was busy doing that, Sona would be forced to deal with a Satan group of rogue fallen angels. She would do it more tactically than Rios' Peerage ever did, and she would collect info on them before going in for the attack. She would find that the group apparently stole the sacred gear from a human priestess, which allowed her to heal others. The way the fallen angel, Metelt, used the sacred gear though was to heal herself, which mimicked the properties of what made the Phoenix clan so special. Sona would struggle with this girl specifically, but eventually managed to put it down. She seemed to have had this sacred gear for a while now, with how knowledgeable she was at using it. Just how long ago did she steal that poor girl's sacred gear? They tried returning the sacred gear to the blonde human, but it appeared to have been too late to revive her. She could have probably had her join her peerage as well at one point with the special healing sacred gear, but it didn't seem that was destined to be. It was a real pity too. She had missed out on two good prospects now. First it was Issei refusing her offer, and now this girl who had been dead for too long to even have a chance at being revived. Now that Sona thought about it, she had become curious of Issei's whereabouts. She hadn't seen him that much around school for a bit. She understood that he was a hunter and all, but his parents were bound to have some form of restriction on when he could go through one of the gates, maybe like only on the weekends, or were they just not aware of the fact that Issei was skipping school? She had no idea that he would have been in another one of the system's generated dungeons though. This time around it would have been in the setting of a demon castle. Issei would have had a long, hard-fought battle against the monsters there, and his mana was draining fast with how some of these monsters were becoming too strong for some of his soldiers, which he had upgraded over time as well. His most recent additions to his ever-expanding army were a set of shadow beasts that looked similar to polar bears, except that they were exceptionally larger and stronger than, well, your average polar bear. He had been stuck in one of those red gates at one time, but he managed to help his group survive through mostly his own power. Many were amazed by Issei's power they were also wondering what sort of class he had with how he displayed multiple qualities, whether it be the strength of a fighter or the magic of a high-class mage. I mean, like, we're crying out loud, it looked like he was using spatial magic at one point. Issei also collected a soldier in the form of a teammate that attempted to stab him in the back. Quite literally. Igris killed him and, well, he extracted the man's shadow, renaming him to, well, be Tank. It was originally meant to be a new recruit for a rather powerful and prominent guild, the White Tigers Guild, he believed was the name of them, but they were just too prideful and well, uncooperative, so Issei found a better purpose for the guy. Issei wished that he could extract the shadow of the boss of the Ice Elves that he fought, since he was someone that pushed Issei to his utmost limits back there. He was even forced to use boosted gear at the end to give his army an extra boost in strength, although it drained Issei's mana faster than before. He supposed it was because of the fact that the first time he used it, it was only on himself, but now he was spreading it to a whole army? Yeah, he can understand why his, well, mana was draining so fast. He was exhausted, but he was glad to have, well, taken down the boss in the end. Then the extraction process, though, he failed to extract this guy's shadow each and every single time for 3 tries straight. It would have been rather disappointing, but at the very least he managed to gain a new weapon from this guy. Now Issei was using this new strength in this demon castle dungeon. Issei remembered Rias talking about being a devil at one point, but when he found his way inside of this gate and started fighting these monsters, he recognized that these guys were more in line with the common depiction of devils and, well, folklore. Not nearly as human-like as Rias and Sona, you could say. He eventually ended up encountering the boss of the dungeon, and they were a rather tanky figure. Issei ended up using the terrain around him in order to have one of the buildings topple over the monster, crushing them. To make sure it didn't get back up, Issei would also slice this guy several times using booster gear to help him in the fight as well. He rarely used the sacred gear, but because of how much mana it consumed. But when it came on to short bursts, well, it was practically a godsend. Especially for situations like this. Issei's rewards from killing the boss would be rather nice. Among them were an orb that increased the magical output well, I guess you could call it like magical girls or like mages or whatever. Yeah, basically for mages essentially. By, well, twofold, a pair of demon earrings that had a skill which would be unlocked when acquiring a couple more items along the way. Some wood that could craft high quality items, and some horns. Yeah, just some horns. This dungeon wasn't a waste of time whatsoever, in Issei's opinion. He practically scored big time here in all honesty. The next boss Issei faced, he would end up retrieving a pair, well, not a pair, but basically the next part of the set that was required. Something that went along with the demon earrings that he had acquired from the last boss. And when it came onto this fight with this boss, well, it would have been rather easy, because this guy apparently seemed to be an undead necromancer. He controlled his own set of rather powerful soldiers, but they would still fall to the might of Issei, Igris, and Iron alone. To complete the set, all Issei had to do now was get the Monarchs ring as well. For now, Issei would decide to head out of the dungeon. He had already gone up, well, like 75 floors, and at this point, he was out of energy. He needed to recharge. He also needed to head back to school now. His absences were beginning to stack up now, and he knew he would get an earful from his mother about this. Hopefully he would be able to get less of a lecture from her about the importance of school when displaying the amount of wealth he managed to gain during his absences from school. And he would be kinda right here. She was upset that he had been missing from school, especially for so long, and on top of that, he wasn't coming home some nights as well, which caused her to worry, but at least he was making some money from being a hunter, or at least she presumed that's where he was getting the money from. She remembered him being an E-rank hunter, but it was as if he went through a second awakening, which allowed him to grow at, well, an exponential rate. And Issei recognized that at this point he was probably around the strength of an S-rank hunter as well. It would practically drown out his mother's quarrels at this point, seeing how he could genuinely make a living off of this. It wasn't like when he was struggling just to make ends meet as an E-rank hunter. He was far above that now. There would be a knock at their door, which would take Issei out to his own thought process, and this would actually get the attention of his mother as well. When opening the door, she would be surprised to see a girl with long ponytails, but she looked somewhat familiar. She would introduce herself as Irina, which would surprise Mrs. Hyodo. Issei's old childhood friend was back in town. Who would have thought? Issei would be surprised as well, but for a rather different reason. You see, for the longest, Issei had thought the kid he used to play with was a guy. There was also another person standing by the door, which was a girl with blue hair with a streak of green at the side as well. She would introduce herself as Zenobia and, well, Irina's teammate. Irina apparently wanted to visit the Hyodo household since she was in town, and she would be amazed with how different Issei looked now. He had a sharp jawline, he was tall, and had a lean but muscular figure. He even had a better haircut as well. He essentially had a mop top with his sides shaved, giving a weird but intriguing mix of maintenance and wildness at the same time. It was probably pretty low maintenance, which worked perfectly for Issei. Irina could tell Issei was stronger at least then when she last met him, but he also exuded a different aura as well. Well, when it came onto the strength parts, it kind of made sense considering the fact that, well, last time they met they were probably like around the age of 8, and to assume that your strength would be the same for like all those years, that would kind of be embarrassing. But yeah, even with that being stated, Issei's strength was still rather immense. It was actually kind of menacing whenever he exuded his aura like this as well. It gave the girls goosebumps actually. They weren't sure if he had turned into a devil or what, but for now, Irina would just be glad to have met Issei and see how much he had matured before leaving the search for the culprit behind, stealing the fragments of Excalibur. Unfortunately, when they ended up finding the thieves, they would quickly realize that they were outmatched by a large margin actually. Zenobia would have managed to escape, but not Irina. Zenobia would search for help before finding Rias in their peerage. She would have been exhausted and quickly explained the situation to them. Rias wouldn't be particularly interested, seeing as how they didn't really gain anything in return. She didn't see it as worth risking the safety of her peerage for someone who wasn't even technically allied with her, but instead an enemy that they just made a truce with for now. Zenobia would be distraught finding that Rias refused to assist her in this dire situation. She was too weak to face off against Kokobiel alone, and she didn't want Irina to die either. Kokobiel wouldn't have had as much of an interest in Rias though. He had gathered some information about a certain someone that piqued his interest though. Issei would have been wrapping up his daily run when he noticed a body in the middle of the street. It looked beaten and battered. He inspected the body a bit until he realized the familiarity. It was Irina who was in such a critical state, and not only that, but there was a note attached to her. It said for him to come by the cool academy backfield if he wanted to avoid having any others be brought to such a severe condition like her. Issei would have been angered and crumbled up the paper after reading it. He'd go into his inventory and find a potent healing potion that he would use on Irina, which would heal any and all of her injuries. She would wake up and be surprised to see Issei, but he had a serious look on his face. He would ask what happened to her, but she wouldn't be all that inclined to tell him at first until he revealed his shadow. His shadow soldiers, which surprised her. The ominous aura of his was, even more intense than Kokobiel's own. She would confess right after how she was searching for the person who had stolen the fragments of Excalibur that was scattered around several of the churches, but when she and Zenobia found them, they wouldn't have realized just how great of a power difference they had to deal with. Issei would request that Irina go back to one of the churches or find somewhere safe. He insisted on dealing with this situation himself, he and his army. Irina would be hesitant, but Issei's intensity would deter her from arguing with him. Issei would summon one of his monster bears to ride on top of, and they would charge forward towards the school. Once Kokobiel descended upon the school campus, he would have ended up emitting a powerful aura which would actually capture the attention of Rias's peerage, Zenobia, Irina, and Issei. Zenobia would have actually gone pale at this moment, and she would begin to mutter on how Kokobiel was here. They could also pinpoint where it was coming from as well. Rias would now be forced to get involved in this situation since he was on her territory, though she wasn't sure how well her peerage would actually stack up against someone of Kokobiel's status. But she would end up summoning a magical circle and teleport herself and her peerage along with Zenobia to the school. She would be surprised to see Issei on the school field as well, though. He would have hopped off of his shadow bear and he would have leaped into the air. He would have ended up sucker punching Kokobiel and he would have been blown back by the punch, but he would get back up and smirk, complimenting Issei's strength right after. Issei would have stayed silent though, and he would have glared at Kokobiel. Kokobiel would have kept the grin on his face though before sending a swarm of light spears at Issei. Each spear would have been parried by Issei though. Monsters would have been summoned to the field as well in order to distract Issei, but he would summon the rest of his soldiers, which would surprise Zenobia and Kokobiel. Kokobiel would be enjoying this show of strength that Issei was displaying, and he would also think back to the rumors that he had heard. It appeared that they were true after all. The Shadow Monarch was back. Issei would have thrown a dagger at Kokobiel, which he would have easily avoided, only for Issei to use Dominator's touch on the item, which would cause for the weapon to turn around and stab Kokobiel in the back. Kokobiel would cough out some blood, but he would have a pleasant smile on his face. It was a smile that Issei just wanted to wipe off so badly. It was annoying. It was as if he looked down on him for crying out loud. He was never going to be treated like a weakling again after all these years he had been one. It's just now he was finally beginning to pick out. It's just now that he was finally able to pick some strength. It's just now that he was finally able to have some strength to call his own, and he wasn't going to just allow somebody to call all of his hard work useless or just to smile at his work in a taunting manner. He was never going to allow that to happen, and he would end up dashing forward and clash with Kokobiel once more, but the fallen angel would block his attack, or at least he tried to. But Issei, he would have ended up showing himself to be too strong for the fallen angel. He would bypass Kokobiel's defenses and he would stab him in the chest with Kasaka's venom fang. The poisonous effects of his dagger, they would end up being negated though by Kokobiel, but he wouldn't be prepared for Issei's next move. You see, Kokobiel's wings would have been mutilated by Issei using the dagger of that elf he managed to kill back in the Red Gate. Freed Selden, a rather flamboyant follower, would have been the one to currently be wielding Excalibur, and he would attempt to charge at Issei once he saw an opening. He saw him as the epitome of all devils and needing to be killed as their only way of repenting for their miserable lives, committing wretched acts of evil. He figured that right now was the best opportunity he had to kill Issei, but Kiba, seeing him wield Excalibur, would immediately be reminded of his suffering because of it, because of this program, of this experiment, and also many years ago, and he would rush in and block the sword with his own, although he wasn't strong enough to hold it off for very long. Excalibur seemed to have some adverse effects on devils, which wasn't all that great for Kiba in this situation, but Issei would have settled the situation though by punching Freed with enough strength that it ended up sending the flamboyant preacher boy flying. The man's chest would have actually collapsed on itself as well, and their heart would have been punctured in the process, ending their life. Issei would pick up the sword that Freed dropped and use it to actually finish off Kokobiel. Issei admired the look of the sword and the stance that it apparently had. He would look around and see how the monsters were being killed off by a mixture of his shadows and Rias' Peerage. Zenobia would be awestruck by Issei's strength, and Kiba would have also finished off Valper Galilee as well, which this would have been his main form of closure after his tormented childhood because of this guy and Excalibur. But from the way that Issei looked at this sword, Excalibur, Kiba could immediately tell that he wouldn't be allowed to simply take and destroy it either. So Galilei would have been his second best option here, and he would be lying if he said it didn't feel good to have finally finished off this guy that turned him into a human experiment when he was younger. After the monsters had all been defeated, Zenobia would walk up to Issei and she would actually comment on his strength, wondering just where exactly he got it from. What sort of training did he do? It was clear that he wasn't. It was pretty clear that he wasn't a member of the church. So was he a devil or a fallen angel that had some vendetta against Kokobiel? Issei would actually explain that he was still human, but had just gone through a second awakening. It wasn't technically a lie either. So he would also explain that he saw Irina's battered body lying in the streets with a note attached to her, wanting him to come here if he wanted to avoid any others getting harmed in the process as well. Zenobia would be worried about Irina's condition until Issei ended up confirming that she was fine since he was able to heal her just in time. Zenobia would actually be relieved hearing this and thank Issei for helping a comrade. Issei would have his army go back in the storage room except for Igris, and he had actually had Igris Excalibur. before having him dissipate as well. Zenobia wanted to comment on how the sword would have changed his property, but she would just end up holding her tongue, figuring that he deserved that much for how much he helped them here. Issei would have gone up a couple levels from this fight, and well, figure it would have been a good time to well add another soldier to his army. Issei would walk up to the deceased body of Kokobiel and summon his shadow to be part of his army. Issei would smirk seeing the shadow of this fallen angel now subservient to him. They were rather strong and he'd give them their original name as well. Issei would place a couple soldiers around his neighborhood as a form of extra protection in case another force came while he wasn't around. Even this condition kept flashing in his mind when he was fighting Kokobiel. He wanted to avoid having that happen to another person, especially one that he was well so close to. Issei would have collected more soldiers after that though, and this next set of soldiers would have been orcs that his army ended up slaying one day when he was looking to earn a few extra bucks. It wasn't part of a guild, so it was hard to gain access to the higher ranked dungeons, and he had yet to get re-ranked either. Things were fairly slow for him, and he wasn't ready to go back in the Demon King's castle dungeon, whatever you want to call it, either, so he'd sign up to be a porter at the last minute for, well, some strike squad, since it seemed like a fairly easy job. He was also curious how these sort of teams operated, and if he could add it to the effectiveness of combat for his own army. The orcs would end up proving to be too powerful for the team that he was with though, and Issei, he would eventually be forced to intervene. Despite the overwhelming numbers, well, the orcs, they just seemed to be no match for Issei's own army, despite the fact that they had the number advantage. It seemed as if Issei's army, despite lacking in numbers, were just overall stronger, and the fact that they could regenerate as well was a plus as well. They would easily put down most of the red orcs and their leader. Issei would have discovered that their leader was some sort of mage, interestingly enough, so this one's strength he valued especially. He would have named this guy to be, well, Tusk, because of the fact that he just could not remember his original name. Issei would have realized that day though that the dungeons, they were becoming more dangerous for some reason. The only things that were holding him back were the fact that he hadn't been reevaluated for his rank, nor was he part of a guild either. The guild part was more of an annoyance, so considering the fact that he could handle a dungeon on his own, but he would just have to join a guild eventually if he wanted higher ranked dungeons as per the rules of the Hunter Association. Well, the rules were mainly that he had to have a team. They had a set number on the amount of people minimum that could go into a dungeon, and well, Issei by his lonesome wouldn't be allowed to go into a dungeon by, well, himself, even if he had his summonings with him, or, well, his shadows. They weren't necessarily considered party members. Well, he was thinking of ways to get around that rule though, somehow. An idea, it would suddenly spark inside of his head though. He would set up an appointment to get his rank checked, since he figured at this point he was around S rank. He would be getting his rank reevaluated very next week though. As for the meantime, Issei, he would just decide to take his chances with the dungeon once again. With his increased stats and stronger army that he had now, the dungeon would have been easier for Issei to handle despite the increasing difficulty each time he entered a new floor. Sure, there was a ton of fire surrounding the areas, but Issei, he would have made sure to unpack appropriately for the occasion, getting more fire resistant clothing, or well, an actual robe at this point for this event. Eventually, he had to face off against what seemed like the top tier Demon King or whatever. And you have to admit, this guy, he was strong, incredibly strong actually. But despite the power this guy displayed, Issei would still be able to find a way to win against him. First, he just had to get him off with that annoying wyvern, or well, dragon, whatever you want to call him. He was the one to actually push Issei to his absolute limits, but he was able to eventually defeat this guy using Commander's Touch once he was able to get him off of his dragon and then be able to fight him in a 1v1. Issei would have grabbed onto this guy's arm at one point, and he would have used Commander's Touch in order to rip apart his body. From there, his physical strength was enough to just end the guy. Issei's rewards, well, they would just actually be rather plentiful for this occasion. Among them were a ring that was apparently the missing piece to that set he was gathering earlier. The Demon King's, well, longsword, which could shoot lightning out of it for some reason. Some daggers that also belonged to the Demon King. Horns, and purified blood from this guy as well. Issei also obtained the Demon King's wyvern, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this wrong. If I pronounce wyvern wrong, just let me know in the comments. But he also obtained a runestone, which actually gave him the skill Shadow Exchange. And he found this to be a rather convenient ability because of the fact that he could teleport out to the dungeon. All he really needed to do was just swap places with one of his shadows, which was outside. Unfortunately, the skill, it had a 3-hour cooldown, so he had to be careful with how he used it. From there, though, Issei, he would settle on flying on his latest shadow, the same wyvern that the Demon King rode on, which he ended up naming Kaizel. Issei would summon Igris and have him exchange Excalibur for the Demon King's longsword, seeing that as more befitting for the Shadow Knight. Issei would be wielding Excalibur from now on, hoping to access more of its abilities when the time was right. It was now only a couple of days left that Issei had before his appointment, and in those couple of days, Issei's presence would actually be requested for something seemingly important. What made it even stranger was the fact that Arias, of all people, was here to retrieve him. This goes prideful, so it must have been serious if she was swallowing her pride to come get him. She'd use a magical circle to tell himself and her, to teleport herself and himself to what seemed like a meeting room full of people that Issei just simply didn't recognize. Well, there was a redhead who did seem kind of similar to Arias. They looked alike, and from the looks of it, he supposed that they were siblings with how youthful he looked. He saw the silver-haired woman as well. He ended up seeing the silver-haired woman, as well as a girl who was dressed up in a magical girl outfit, a man with black and gold hair, and a guy wearing some royal gold armor. There was something even more peculiar about this guy in particular, though, and that was what was on top of his head. Now that Issei was really looking at it, was that a halo? What? Was he dead? Yeah, Issei was confused, and when it came onto their strength as well, that's something that also shocked Issei, because of the fact that these guys were on par with that of a national level hunter, or at least a very high S-ranked hunter. He wanted to know just what he had gotten himself into. The one with red hair would explain the situation to Issei on the fact that they were here to make a peace treaty among the three factions, but hearing that someone of Issei's caliber was involved with the defeat of Kokobiel, they all figured it would be a good idea to actually include him on this. Issei would be confused though until X ended up revealing his true status, Issei's true status, and that was, well, apparently him being the vessel of the Shadow Monarch, an immensely powerful entity that had been a prominent figure in the faction wars. Issei was also the current Red Dragon Emperor, which made his potential immense. Issei would butt in, explaining though that they wanted Issei to join the peace treaty since it would benefit everybody here. They'd be willing to offer Issei luxuries beyond his wildest imagination and some of the realm's most beautiful women if he was really into that, as well to, well, tempt him into signing the treaty. Issei would have been thinking about it and he would become interested, more so with the luxuries. Before he could properly agree though, the Chaos Brigade, they would actually make themselves known at this point. Most of them would have been mages though, but they would have been led by this one woman by the name of Kateria Leviathan. They would declare that they would be reclaiming their birthright, and that involved killing off individuals such as X and Seraphol who stole said birthrights, turning their family names into titles. Issei would have found this woman to be an annoyance, so and he would just simply knock her out using the soldiers. He didn't really kill her though, he just knocked her out. The only reason he didn't actually kill Kateria was for, well, a pretty shallow reason, and that was because she was kinda cute, you could say, or like she was attractive. He had long moved past this perverted nature, or like his perverted days, where he was like a pretty well-known peeping Tom and all, but you'd be lying if he said his hormones didn't get the better of him every now and then. Raleigh, the White Dragon Emperor, would have watched Issei's display of strength and he'd be kinda impressed. So this was his rival, huh? It seemed like he was going to be a difficult opponent. He liked that. Issei would hand Kateria over to the faction leaders so that they could figure out what to do with her from there. He also would let them know he accepted their peace treaty. He doubted that he would get involved with too many of their affairs though, since he had his own business to deal with most of the time on Earth. Everyone could agree to that, and they would just be glad to know that they had a vessel of the Shadow Monarch on their side this time around. A couple days later, Issei would go on to get reevaluated, and he'll be confirmed to be of an S rank status, which was a rather huge announcement. Once he was registered as an S rank hunter, the paparazzi, they would be all over him. Everyone would have known, but Issei wouldn't necessarily be, well, all that concerned about this fame. You see, he liked it and all, but he was more concerned with building his guild from the ground up now. He had to find a couple of members as well, and he couldn't really think of anyone at first, but he would just decide to pay a visit to Sir Zex after asking Rias of his whereabouts. He'd expressed his desire to create his own guild, similar to how devils had peerages, but he needed some help with setting it up. Sir Zex would laugh before mentioning how he could set up a building for the boy, and he had just the people in mind to join his guild. The next day, Issei would be introduced to his new base of operations, which looked like an extravagant castle. Yeah, this guy went over the board. He kind of just face-palmed now that he was realizing that Sir Zex's influence was just written all over it. This guy just seemed to want to please Issei way too much. He also would be introduced to his new guild members once he went inside, and to his shock, Rias would be there alongside Akino, Kiba, Zenobia, and, well, Irina as well. Apparently, Sir Zex was able to pull some strings to get Zenobia and Irina on Issei's guild. As for Rias and Akino, it would have been rather easy to convince them to join. Rias was able to keep her peerage, and, well, get out of her marriage with Riser Phoenix. Ryza wasn't all that thrilled at first to find out that Cerezex was the voice in these two, and the Phoenix clan would also try to find out the purpose behind it all, until Cerezex ended up revealing the fact that he wanted his little sister to join the current Shadow Monarchs guild and create close ties with him. This would have actually been more than enough to cause for their family to agree with Cerzek's decision. Sure, they wished that they could have created a strong, offspring mixed with, Phoenix blood and Gremory blood, the power of destruction and the ability to regenerate like a phoenix. That would have been amazing. That would have been a really powerful sort of offspring, especially for the Phoenix clan. Their legacy would have continued on in such a powerful, devil like that offspring. It would have been amazing. Their potential would have been off of the charts. But if Cerezex actually was telling the truth, the Shadow Monarch mixed with Gremory magic, or like a Gremory's ability to destroy. Basically, what am I saying? Basically, destruction magic mixed with shadow magic or necromancy, whatever you want to really call it. That would be incredibly dangerous, incredibly powerful, incredibly potent. Shoot, if they play their cards right, they could end up having the next Phoenix blood mixed with the blood of the Shadow Monarch and Gremory to create a way more powerful offspring. And if they were to allow Rias to be with the Shadow Monarch for now, they could actually make that even more of a reality, make that seem more plausible to happen, because they would have ended up creating good relations with the Shadow Monarch from early on. As for Akino and Kiba, they would have also expressed their desire to Cerezex to join Issei's guild when finding out what was going to be happening to Rias. Issei wouldn't really complain though, so long as they just didn't get in his way. Sure, they would just need to enter a couple of dungeons with him from time to time, but that was pretty much about it. He'd explain the situation to them, that they didn't really have to fight in the gates. Rather, they would just mainly be there for show, since he needed some people as part of his guild to enter the dungeons, or the gates, whatever you really want to call them, just for representation state. Just for the fact that he needed numbers, essentially. He just needed these couple people that enter the dungeons all the time with him, and they could literally just be on standby most of the time while Issei did most of the work. Especially when it came on to the A and S ranked. Those were mainly Issei's territory. If they wanted to take on some of the weaker gates as well though, then that would pretty much be fine by him, just so long as they left the S and A rank for him and him alone. Rias would actually have no issue with this whatsoever, and she'll be the first one to agree to this. She could literally live in luxury without having to do anything besides just going into some of the dungeons and not even really have to be lifting a finger. She would still be credited as someone noteworthy just because of the fact that she was always seen with Issei whenever he was entering the gates, and they would always come back successful, or at least that's what she presumed would be the case, considering as much as she had seen from Issei so far. It sounded like a pretty sweet deal in her opinion, and the others would agree not too long later. Although he would have actually requested to accompany Issei on some of his A and S tier raids later on when he was stronger. He wanted to help Issei in these fights after all, and Issei mused over it for a minute before shrugging. He would actually agree to it. He didn't really care, just so long as Kiba knew his strengths and his weaknesses. He didn't want to end up losing anybody after all. From there, Issei, he would just continue to gain prominence and strength, and at one point he even managed to clear an island full of monsters, mostly by himself. He was with a guild, not a guild, but a group of high-rank hunters from across the world, well, mainly just in Korea and Japan. But with these hunters, despite their strengths, they wouldn't necessarily be strong enough to actually handle the monsters by themselves, considering how each generation seemed to evolve to be stronger than the last. The monsters on the, well, island, that is. These were monsters that had to be dealt. These were the sort of monsters that had to be dealt with. The ones that could evolve rapidly, they were incredibly dangerous, and Issei's Shadow Army, they would have been the ones that actually intervene in their times of need, and they would also be able to actually kill off the Ant Queen and their strongest soldier, making the island habitable for humans once more. Issei would have also ended up using this opportunity in order to gain more, well, soldiers to add to his army. Of course, these being the bug monsters that he ended up slaughtering before. Issei, when the camera stopped rolling, this would have been his time. This would have actually been his time to extract the shadow of the Ant Queen's strongest soldier and name him Beru. He also ended up getting some answers towards what was the whole thing with the system when he found himself re-entering the dungeon that gave him the system in the first place by fighting the creator of the system, the architect. This guy would have been rather cocky at first. They were seemingly looking down at him, and they also seemingly had a good amount of control over the system because of the fact that they were able to literally disable most of Issei's abilities that came with the system, such as his Shadow Army and his use of status recovery. Even his potions that were found in his inventory weren't allowed in this fight. What made things worse was the fact that he had to fight not only the architect but his statue puppets as well, the same ones that plunged a hole through his body the first time around when he was in the double dungeon. Back when he was an E-rank hunter, Issei at least still had his supreme strength, speed, his weapons, and the commander's touch. Issei would do his best against the statues, and he had to admit that they were rather strong, but they weren't strong enough to overpower him this time around. The advantage was the fact that they had numbers, but through a combination of Issei's strength and commander's touch, Issei would destroy most of the soldiers. The architect would be rather impressed with how much Issei had grown since he had first been given the system, but the onslaught would only continue from there. Issei would be pushed to his absolute limits during this fight, and he would notice at one point that his commander's touch had leveled up and evolved to its final form, Commander's Authority. Commander's Authority would be proven to be an incredibly strong asset with how Issei was able to combine his speed and strength with it. With Issei's inventory, he would pull out Excalibur at one point in order to penetrate through the giant statue, which could shoot lasers. He knew that one especially was incredibly dangerous, but thanks to one of his abilities that came with Excalibur, he was able to end up destroying the large statue's head easily. This would have shocked the architect because of the fact that this wasn't necessarily something he was really aware about beforehand. Sure, he knew about the system, but he didn't necessarily know about all of the weapons. Issei would have been under the assumption that that was the end though, but the architect, he would just wave his fingers and explain that the test wasn't finished yet. He still had one more opponent. That opponent would of course be the architect himself. Issei would be irritated with the constant additions to this test of his, but he would continue to persevere. Since it didn't seem like he really had a choice here, Issei would try using Excalibur's abilities against the architect, but they only left scratches at first. Commander's authority was ineffective since the architect appeared to have the same ability as well. Issei would attempt to use his strength, but it would only be beneficial in holding back some of the attacks from the architect. Issei was being brought to the brink of death by the architect's relentless attacks until he began to evolve at an even more rapid rate than before. He was knocking on death's door, but it was as if that was when his growth was at its best, considering how he was suddenly able to observe the architect's attacks easier and dodge. He was even able to parry some of their attacks and cut the architect's arms off at one point as well, which would shock the architect. He would force the architect to kneel before him. He was originally planning on killing them, but he needed answers. He had been given a couple of hints thanks to the likes of Sir Zex, Azazel, and Michael, but he didn't want puzzle pieces anymore. He wanted to hear the whole truth and nothing but the truth as to the origin of his abilities, straight from the architect, considering how he created the system. Suddenly, Issei's mind would be invaded by knowledge regarding the faction wars and his status as the Shadow Monarch after he ended up clicking yes as to, well, the system retrieving his memories. That was something that, what do you call his name? That the architect actually gave to Issei. He mentioned that the memories had been inside him this whole time. The answers had been inside of Issei the whole time. All he needed to do was just click the yes option that was on, well, the box that was being displayed before him. Of course, Issei would end up not really getting all the answers though, despite everything that was being shown to him with these wars that were happening. Despite the sudden influx of memories, it still didn't answer everything, and Issei would find out though that there were other monarchs out there. That was the only thing that Issei really found to be beneficial out of all of this knowledge that was just being, well, forced upon him. All of this knowledge did not help Issei whatsoever when it came on to actually knowing the origin of his abilities. Sure, he saw his potential, but that was about it. His potential and the fact that there were other monarchs that needed to be put down. And from the way that the architect talked about these monarchs, it seemed like he was praising them as if he was on their side, meaning he had to put the architect down as well. The architect would show visible confusion, wondering why Issei still had control over his own body. He would immediately attack Issei, beginning to realize the true gravity of the situation now. The architect would be no match for Issei though, especially with this new power-up of his that the system called, well, excuse me if I got this name wrong, but Blackheart. He was given the bonus of 100,000 mana points, which made his, well, whole issue of consuming mana practically non-existent now. The architect would have found all of this to be preposterous. He never expected to be betrayed by the Shadow Monarch like this, and he wasn't expecting to have been surpassed by a mere human either. Issei would summon all of his daggers and point them towards the architect. He would even point Excalibur towards the architect's throat, and he would demand answers if he wanted to live. The architect would try to gain power in this situation. He would try to gain some sort of standing in this situation by explaining that Issei couldn't necessarily kill him, since there would be no one to stop his status. Not status, but his statues. But one wave of Excalibur was all that was needed in order to destroy all of the statues though, turning that threat of his when it came onto the statues into, well, a pretty empty threat. The architect would just be aghast at this point before trying to come up with another reason for why Issei should not kill him. and him not having to tell Issei anything. Well, even if, well, more so his fake body. He forgot. He forgot for a second that this was a fake body of his, but the threat felt so real. They would try to reason with Issei by explaining that the system would disappear with him if Issei killed him, or at least this fake body of his, but from the seams of it, he had a feeling that even with the fake body, Issei could practically go into the other realm where his real body was well, basically like this. He had a feeling that even with this fake body of his, Issei could make his way through and actually kill his very soul. He would find a way to get to, well, the architect's actual real body and destroy it from, well, the fake body. And that threat was incredibly dangerous if he could really do so. Even if he couldn't, he didn't want to lose this fake body of his. He would try to reason more and more, but Issei would just catch on to his bluff one more time. He would catch on to his bluff rather easily, and he would explain that just because the architect created a system didn't necessarily mean that there was some sort of symbiotic bond between these two. Issei would also reveal that he had boosted gear to the architect, bringing up the fact that if he were to actually return to, well, being an E-rank hunter, losing the system and all, he would still have the boosted gear, which was not part of the system whatsoever. He could practically just use that in order to become as strong as possible if he really needed to. And the architect, finding this out, would immediately try to quickly delete the system and even try to remove the boosted gear from Issei's body as well, remove the sacred gear from Issei, but he would be denied access to his own creation, and the sacred gear would practically reject the architect as well. He realized now that he had no standing in this situation whatsoever, and this body that the architect was using would be completely destroyed by Issei now. Issei was the one to have had full control over the system at this point, and Issei, he would just make his way out to a double dungeon and be exhausted, but he would still be standing nonetheless. He just needed to rest for a couple of days was all. He ended up collapsing in the middle of the street, and he would find himself in a hospital. He would be resting, and he would end up keeping up with the news for the most part. For those days that he was stuck hospitalized, he would end up finding out that a large portal ended up appearing in the middle of Japan, which was considered of an S-rank status. This portal wasn't something that could simply be handled by any A-rank or even S-rank hunter. Not any S-rank hunter. You had to be at the very top of the S-rank status if you were going to go in and try to close that portal, close that dungeon, go into the gate and actually deal with the monsters inside there. Issei would actually end up requesting a favor from the other factions, and that would be for one of the leaders to deal with holding back the dungeon for now while he recovered in the hospital. Seraphal would actually be more than willing to help, seeing this as a bit of a publicity stunt as well for her magical girl show. She wouldn't have necessarily been able to neutralize the threat, but she was able to hold back a good amount of the giants that were in that dungeon. It took Issei 3 days to recover fully and step in. Finding that Seraphal still hadn't returned from the dungeon caused for Issei to grow concerned. She had the strength of a national level hunter, but even they had limits. Issei would he would enter the dungeon and find a bloodied Seraphal. Several giants were trying to gang up on her, but Issei would shoot his daggers through them, killing them. Any other giants that were there, Issei would use his shadows to defeat and afterwards add to his expansive army. He couldn't be bothered to give a lot of the giants proper names, so he would just use numbers and shapes for the most part when naming them. Eventually, Issei and Seraphal would have finished off all of the giants and make their way deep inside the dungeon only to find a giant that seemed to be chained up for some reason. This one was even larger than the other giants that they had met before, that they had defeated. Seraphol would have immediately recognized this guy as Legia? I don't know how you pronounce this guy's name. This was a monarch of the beginning and king of giants. She was well aware of his destructive power from the faction wars, but the rulers were able to put this guy down. She wasn't exactly sure whether he was dead or not for the longest, but this confirmed what happened to him. Issei would be confused though. Seraphol, seeing his confusion, would explain the history behind the monarch of the beginning. Legia would make an offer with Issei to join forces in exchange for freeing him, since the boy was going to need as much allies as possible, especially after Seraphol explained the whole story with, well, Legia as well. But Issei, he wouldn't trust the monarch in the slightest. He had a bad feeling about freeing this guy. Looking back at the memories of the previous monarch as well, it seemed like the monarchs weren't all that trustworthy whatsoever. He even had to kill one of the monarchs because of the fact that they tried betraying him at one point. The rulers had to have imprisoned this guy for a reason he wasn't in a mood for finding out, so he would instead actually kill this monarch. Issei was the devil faction. Well, Issei was in the devil faction's debt for fending off against this high-ranked gate while he was recuperating from his fight with the architect. And to repay them, Issei would use one of his elixirs he had gained from the Demon Castle dungeon in order to bring one of their kin out of a coma that she had been in for seemingly the last century. The girl's name was Ingvill, and she was apparently a Leviathan from, well, the ancient devils, you could say. She was literally part of the ancient devil's bloodline, Leviathan. And she was apparently related to Kateria Leviathan as well, because of the fact that they were seemingly cousins of some sort. Ingvill didn't seem to really care about the whole issue of her whole family name now being used as a title though, but instead she was just glad to have just been able to wake up from this coma of hers. Issei would have also given the devil faction the elixirs, the rest of the elixirs, thinking that they could probably mass produce some if they really wanted to. He kept one for himself though, just in case. Well, two actually, just in case. Seraphol would also be using Issei for a publicity stunt. This publicity stunt would be, well, Issei going on her magical girl show as a guest star. His presence would immediately send ratings through the roof, causing for Issei to become a recurring character on the show until he earned his own spin-off show, albeit his was a bit more, well, edgier. He appealed with the older audiences, to say the very least, but some of the younger kids liked his aesthetic as well, and they liked the sort of edge and tone that Issei gave off. Issei would also fend off against Loki when finding out that the man was trying to set up Ragnarok, having several giant wolves and other creatures attack the underworld, hoping to kill, well, Odin. Loki wouldn't have planned for Issei being there though, considering the lack of involvement with the underworld until recently. He thought that he was just there for a couple of days and a couple of days only. He never thought that Issei would stick around long enough to actually be involved in, well, defeating his army of wolves and other monsters. It would have ended up being a massacre for Loki's army, as they did not even hold a candle to Issei's own army with how much more powerful they were. None of the faction leaders would even have to lift a finger there in this situation. Issei would add the wolves to his army and he would contemplate killing Loki as well, but Odin would actually advise against it because of the fact that The trickster also had his own following, so that could incite another war. It might be better to just imprison Loki for now, which Issei would be fine with. Issei would also return to school after his dealings with the underworld, and he would be treated by most of the school populace like a celebrity. This sort of attention was something that Issei had a hard time adjusting to. Thankfully, Issei would be allowed to escape from it all one day, with his class having a field trip to Kyoto for, the next couple of days. And Issei would have been all across Japan at this point, due to the fact that he was an adventurer. Well, not an adventurer, but a hunter. His adventures as a hunter would involve him finding all of these different portals, going into these different gates, learning about the different aspects to these gates, and having to be in different parts of Japan at a time. But this would have also been the first time that he would be allowed to just enjoy a vacation, not having to worry about saving the world again. This was until he ended up meeting the yokai and finding out that someone apparently kidnapped the leader of their faction, Yasaka. They would have attacked him at first, believing him to be the culprit behind it, until they ended up having a deeper feel for his aura. At that moment, they would have realized who they had just tried messing with, and they would quickly apologize, even bowing down, fearing for their lives, knowing just how strong the Shadow Monarch was. Issei, after being explained the whole situation, would just sigh though. He would do his best to help them find their yokai leader and end up discovering that she was being held captive by the hero faction. The leader of the hero faction, Salsa, would try to convince Issei to join his group though, when realizing that Issei was still biologically human and hadn't been converted into a devil or anything yet. He was just immensely powerful, and Issei, he would just deny Salsa's offer though, explaining that he could become stronger by himself and he wouldn't be with people who tried to kidnap others either. Salsa, he wouldn't take no for an answer though. If Issei said no now, he was going to say yes later. He just had to beat it into Issei. He had to beat Issei into submission. But this plan of his would fail immensely because of the fact that he was just too weak. His divine spirit didn't seem to hold up well against Issei whatsoever, and Issei's army, they would have taken down the rest of the hero faction in this vicinity as well. He would have thought that this was the end, but he would have made the mistake of letting his guard down. The consequence of that action would be that his heart would be punctured by the beast monarch who would actually snuck up behind him during all of this. There was no honor in these sort of fights, and the hero faction was nothing more than just a distraction for the beast monarch and the rest of the monarchs to end up getting the hit on Issei. Issei would cough up blood, and the last thing Issei would end up seeing was his current status. That being, of course, that the player had died, or well, so he thought, because the black heart was still beating in the heart, and the black heart would have been that of the Shadow Monarch. Issei would be brought to an illusion world where he would end up meeting the former Shadow Monarch, Ashborn, and he would discuss his desires in this world. Issei wanted to become strong enough to protect everyone he cared for, and to become Harem King as well. Well, actually, that last part was a joke, but he still had some of his perverted ways, but they were mostly wiped clean at this point. He had bigger priorities now, and the system practically forced him to grow up fast as well. Ashborn would question whether Issei wanted to go back out there or not, to which Issei would declare that he wanted to finish this fight. This would please Ashborn. He would have a smile on his face hearing that, and he would grant Issei the rest of his power with no restrictions whatsoever, feeling as if his body was strong enough to handle it all now. The system would cease to have a purpose now and disappear. Issei would return to the fight and erupt in a burst of mana, shocking the beast monarch. He would immediately call for backup before his arm ended up getting cut off. Issei's army would also return to their original strength when they were living, and some would become even more strong, while even more powerful than when they were living creatures. Issei's army would only continue to expand from there, as there wasn't much the Beast Monarch or any of the other monarchs for that matter who could really do in this situation. The Beast Monarch would have died, and Issei would have hunted down the Insect Monarch and the Frost Monarch as well before slaying them. The angels would end up leading Issei to the Chaos World after his work was done in Kyoto, so he could deal with the remaining monarchs. These remaining monarchs would be the Monarch of Transfiguration. Well, the Monarch of Transfiguration, the Monarch of Iron Body, or like the Iron Body Monarch, and well, the Monarch of Destruction. By the way, if you guys hear any background noise like lawnmower or anything, I apologize for that. That's something I can't control. But the Monarch of Destruction would have been the one that took Issei a while. It would have taken a while for all of them, but that was mainly because they would all try to flee away from Issei. But in the end, Issei would slay every last one of them. Only the Monarch of Destruction was the one that required for Issei to end up using boosted gear though, because of the fact that this guy was immensely powerful. This was the strongest monarch he had to face, and he just needed more assistance from the boosted gear, just for that little extra boost in order to actually put down, well, the Monarch of Destruction. He also needed the assistance of the rulers somewhat to finish off Antares. Issei would return a champion and just be glad to have kept the casualties to a minimum. With the monarchs defeated, Issei would find that there was just one more thing he had to deal with, and that was Valley Lucifer, the White Dragon Emperor, his rival. The match would be short-lived though, with the gap in their strength being too much for Valley. Despite how much Valley tried to keep up with Issei, the power difference only ever continued to grow drastically. Valley would have been left defeated and in a crater. He wasn't dead though. Valley was the least of Issei's concerns at this point. Issei would end up dropping out of school, focusing more on expanding his guild and entering into different forms of work, since he had a feeling that since he ended up taking down all of the monarchs now, the hunter business wasn't going to last for much longer, since he defeated, you guys already know, but he had a feeling that the portals weren't going to really be opening up like they used to, now that he had defeated all of these monarchs, and there wasn't really much of a reason to set up for a war anymore either. There were a couple rogue monsters from different factions that appeared every now and then, but not nearly to the extent of how it had been, with the gates popping up everywhere. And Issei within the next 10 years would end up turning this guild into a mix of a mining company, entertainment, and a myriad of other things, thanks to the productivity of her shadows. And this would be where the story ends. Because I can't really think of much more of a suiting ending. Like, sure, Issei would end up probably going into some more worlds as well, just to defeat more monsters, defeat more enemies, and that would pretty much be it for the most part. Issei going into like these different worlds, expanding his guild, and shoot, I don't even know, maybe he would marry Rias and Akino if you really want that to happen, and they would end up having a really powerful offspring, I guess. But yeah, that's pretty much for you guys to interpret, because I can't really think of a good ending for this series. which seems to be the case for most DXD whatever. So like, yeah, peace.